Throughout the 19th century, references are frequently made to a language of parasols, and in that context, they are referring to the parasol's use as an object of flirtation, which is one of its main uses outside of shading yourself from the sun. But today I'd like to familiarize everyone with another language of parasols, that being the name for each element that makes up the parasol's frame. It's my eventual plan to make a series of videos describing the evolution of the parasol through the 19th century and into the early 20th century. But before that, I figure we would take a moment to visually explore each element of the parasol's frame, by way of camera. While names for each element of the parasol frame remain fairly static through the 19th century, there are variations in nomenclature depending on which side of the Atlantic you are on. Those differences I'll try to make note of as we go along. Today we'll be using a circa 1860 bone-folding carriage parasol as our main example of study. It's probably really blown out in this shot, but I've already restored this frame and it's ready to take a cover. However, I still have to design the embroidery as this is going to have an embroidered cover. More on that later. But first, a minor conversational diversion. The term carriage parasol is applied to smaller, more decorative parasol frames as opposed to larger, plainer, walking length frames. Size is often used to determine the age of a parasol frame, but this isn't a completely reliable method, as parasols were made in multiple sizes throughout the 19th century. So it's not unusual to find two parasols that are stylistically the same, but two completely different sizes. But if you're only using size as a method of determining a parasol's age, you're going to be putting these two parasols in completely different periods. What you'll want to use instead are stylistic cues and proportions. We'll get to more of that in another video later on. We start first at the top of the frame, and at the top of every parasol will be the finial. Finial seems to be the term used in the US, whereas ferrule was used in England. Varying wildly in elaboration, finials and ferrules can be made from any number of materials. There are even finials covered in silk thread, in the same manner as silk thread used to cover tassel header beads. When not in use, parasols were often carried by the finial, usually by way of a finger ring, which could be made fixed or able to swivel. These finger rings could be round or lyre-shaped and variations thereof. While we are here at the top of the frame, let's briefly talk about another parasol style we can find in the 19th century, called the pagoda. This style of parasol's cover is supported by an inner spring to keep the upward point under tension. The pagoda-style parasol appears numerous times throughout the 19th century. Starting in the 1810s, it would continue to be seen into the 20th century. Next, we're removing the finial so that we can see more clearly the headwire. Headwire was a term used for parasols with whalebone or rattan ribs. This term is used for the point at which the ribs are threaded to a loop of wire, which itself is wired to the top of the stem of the parasol. As steel ribs superseded whalebone and rattan, the headwire was replaced with a fabricated brass fitting cut with grooves to accept the wired ribs, called a top notch. The basic shape of this fitting is still used on parasol and umbrella frames today. Attached to the headwire or top notch are the ribs of the parasol. Most parasol frames have 8 ribs, but depending on the period, more or fewer ribs can be seen, with as few as 4 or as many as 16 ribs to a single parasol frame. Ribs were made in 3 materials over the course of the century: whalebone, more correctly known as baleen, rattan, and steel. Baleen is found in what are referred to as plates, located in the mouths of baleen whales. Found in lengths from 2 inches to 13 feet long, baleen plates are used by the whale to filter food from the water as it swims along, by way of the plate's hairy edges. Baleen is made of keratin, the same protein that makes up our own hair and nails, so it's a dense, flexible material that, in the period, made it ideal for application in parasol manufacturing, corset and garment boning, and whip making. Rattan, frequently referred to as cane in the period, is a lightweight, flexible, fibrous material, originating from a climbing species of palm found in the rainforests of Indonesia. It became a preferred substitute for the heavier, more expensive baleen parasol ribs, despite its drawback of becoming brittle over time. Steel ribs came about after much experimentation in Europe after 1800. French manufacturers experimented with brass ribs, but to no avail, as brass lacked strength under flexion. It wasn't until Henry Holland of Birmingham, England, patented a drawn steel wire rib in 1840 that a durable metal rib was successfully produced, and by 1860, metal ribs were frequently seen on the market, advertised under numerous different names. The periods in which these materials were used will be discussed more at length in the future. It can be quickly summarized that baleen and rattan were the most common materials used for parasol ribs up until about 1860. In the United States, Atlantic whale fisheries experienced a collapse in the late 1850s, resulting in most umbrella and parasol manufacturers switching from baleen to rattan by 1865. The English, being the largest manufacturers of steel ribs in the mid-19th century, were using steel ribs widely by the end of the 1850s, and were the largest exporters of steel ribs in the world, frequently providing steel ribs for American manufacturers. Continental Europe, however, seemed slower to adopt steel ribs, and baleen and rattan continued to be used in umbrella and parasol manufacturing into the 1870s. Most manufacturing exclusively used steel ribs by 1875. As we move down the length of the rib, roughly halfway down we come to the area known as the hinge. This is the place that the steel stretcher meets the rib. It is at this point that the rib is under the most stress. At the hinge is a collar of thin metal known as a git. The git is meant to structurally stabilize baleen and rattan ribs where they are drilled to be attached with a stretcher. Moving to the end of the rib, we come to the rib tip. Not all parasols can be found with bone tips like this particular example, and many had their ribs turned into little decorative shapes at their ends, foregoing the more expensive bone, ivory, or pearl rib tips. Having looked at the ribs, let's follow back down the stretchers to where they're wired together at the slide. When the parasol frame is not in use, the slide is held in place by way of the handspring. Handsprings do not appear on all parasols, and other methods were used to keep them closed when not in use. Rings were sometimes used to hold them closed, and those rings could be fashioned either from ivory, thread-covered metal, fabric, or braid. Another method that was preferred were little brass clips with bell-shaped bone beads on an elastic cord. The bone bead goes around the parasol, and this slots into the clip. The parasol is kept open by the top spring. Various methods were devised by manufacturers in Europe and the United States to improve on the basic handspring, top spring, and slide. While not present on the example that we're looking at, many smaller parasols have another hinge above the top spring called a marquee hinge. Most marquee hinges are operated by opening the parasol slightly further than the top spring and then tilting the parasol over the hinge. The slide seats itself on the hinge and remains in a tilted position. This hinge gets its name from the Marquis de Pompadour, who is said to have favored the style. As with many aspects of the parasol, the marquee hinge is the subject of a number of patents in the period, and another example here by Parisian manufacturer Émile Chargé, made around 1865, shows how ingenious some of these hinges can be, operated by just the lightest touch of a cylindrical release to tilt the parasol. The toothed edge of the hinge clicks into the release to allow it to be held at different angles. Whether or not your parasol has a marquee hinge, it will most likely have a stop wire to keep the frame from overexpanding. This can be either a half loop of wire or a wire post hammered into the stem. All of these elements are found on the stem of the parasol, which is basically referring to the center stick above the handle. Folding parasols will typically have a hinge cover over the hinge to lock the parasol into a rigidly straight position when in use. Sometimes plain, elaborately engraved, or tooled with the manufacturer's name, hinge covers can be made of inexpensive materials or gold, ivory, or silver. These two were the subject of many patents in the period, as some thought the hinge cover unsightly, and many of these inventions attempted to reduce the visual impact of the join in the folding parasol's stem. It stands to mention that not all parasols in the 19th century folded. Small carriage parasols with straight handles are frequently seen, but the majority of smaller parasols surviving today are folding frames. The remaining length of the parasol below the hinge is referred to as the handle. Whether made from lacquered or faux-grained wood, ebony, rosewood, or coromandel, bone, ivory, or translucent horn, inlaid or set with gems, the handle of the parasol is often its most decorative element, but they can be found as plain or elaborate as one can imagine. At the end of the parasol handle is usually some kind of terminal. This particular one has a ball. Other shapes you find are little finger crooks, like these deadstock finger crooks from the 1810s, or pommels, or T-shapes like this one, turned from walrus tusk in the 1860s, or hooks, or loops, or rings, or other things. These finials could be made from bone, ivory, or pearl, especially when the material of the handle is some sort of wood. And those, my friends, are the names that make up the elements of the parasol frame. But you may be asking, what about the cover? Well, that brings us to part 2. So let's start from the frame out, starting with little circles or squares of self fabric or holland cloth that are sometimes found fastened over the gits called prevents. In many lined examples, prevents are used at the gits to prevent wear to the outer silk cover. Prevents also seem to be mostly put by the wayside if the parasol is not lined, but there are exceptions to this rule. Similar to prevents, baffles prevent wear to the silk cover at the head wire. These are circles cut from scraps of plain or patterned silk or holland cloth. To prevent gloves and mitts from getting snagged as the parasol is open, baffles can also be seen at the slide. On unlined parasols, these can be made from leather, or silk in the form of a small rosette. Lined pieces exclusively use a silk rosette at the slide. These have 2 duties. One to cover the little gathering stitch to secure the lining to the slide, and to protect those little lace mitts. The interior of a parasol could be finished with a lining, usually made of a plain weave China silk or a plain woven raw silk called pongee. Being made of ultralight, very shifty silk, I can personally attest that these linings are a pain to cut and sew, but I have methods on dealing with that. Linings typically had their seam allowances folded over on themselves, meaning the seam would be sewn, usually by hand, with a running stitch through 4 layers of fabric. This style of seam is sometimes used on outer covers when not lined. Most linings are made and affixed to the frame below the rib, tacked at intervals along the rib's length, giving a wonderful sculptural quality to the lining. Parasols can also be flat-lined, and that lining can be attached with the cover to the upper side of the rib, leaving the ribs exposed. In some of the very finest parasols, the ribs themselves could be cased in silk matching the lining or outer cover, and be made to visually disappear when seen from below. Regardless of how the parasol is lined, it is finished in the same way. At the edge of the cover, the outer cover silk and lining silk would be folded right sides together and then stab stitched to finish the edge of the lining. When the cover's edges are pinked, the lining is pinked shorter than the outer cover, so that the lining doesn't show when the parasol is closed. Now to the outer cover, the pretty parts. There's so much variety among parasol covers that it makes it difficult to cover in one video, but I'm going to try to be as general as possible. Parasol covers for the majority of the 19th century were made from silk. However, other materials outside of silk are found as well, the most common being linen and cotton. A wide array of silks were used for parasol covers: file, moire, taffeta, twill, tussauds, satin. These silks could be plain, figured, or in the case of moire, watermarked by what is called a calendaring machine. Warp printing is also seen, where the fabric is printed on the warp, then woven with the weft, resulting in a slight offsetting of the pattern. Elaborately figured silks were woven on the most advanced jacquard weaving machines of their time, which ran on punch cards, which basically made them the ancestors to the computers that sent us to the moon. Which is why I say when ladies of the mid-19th century went out in their elaborately figured silks, they were wearing and displaying the most advanced technology of their time, whether they knew it or not. It's important to note that manufacturers in the period used silks that were specifically woven to be made into parasol and umbrella covers, and it's very common to find parasol covers finished only with the selvage. Parasol covers for the majority of the 19th century were sewn by hand. Manufacturers were very slow in adopting the sewing machine as they didn't want to invest the additional capital or pay their workers a wage that reflected their skill in using the sewing machine. So parasol covers weren't exclusively sewn by machine until some point in the 1870s. That being said, There were manufacturers in the 1850s and 60s that were marketing parasols with covers sewn by machine, marketed as being superior machine made. Okay, so now that we have all that aside, we can start talking about the elements of the cover. Unless you're looking at one of the amazing patented one-piece silk covers made by Sangster in 1855, the parasol's cover generally would have the same number of pieces, called gores or panels, I say panels myself, as the number of ribs that the frame has. Most of the time, you'll be dealing with 8-panel covers. The panels could be cut straight along the bottom or with a downward dip in the middle, called a baveline. I actually have never found an English language term for this part of the cover, but I have found them referred to in France as bavelines, so we're going with that. Panels are usually cut with bavelines when the edges are finished with scalloped pinking, which was a revival of an 18th century finishing technique for trimming. When not pinked or lined, parasol covers would be finished with a very narrow hem, turned over twice, and sewn with a very fine running stitch. Or, whether cut with bavelines or not, they're sometimes edged with fringe. Fringe could be sewn on or tied on. Tied-on fringe was made by tying lengths of silk thread in bunches directly into the finished edge of the cover. In the case of fringe being sewn on, a pre-made woven fringe is, for lack of a better word, sewn on to the edge of the cover. These fringes are normally made from heavier silk threads, the lightest I've seen being akin to a buttonhole twist. Compare that to tied-on fringe, which basically uses a sewing weight thread, thus all the wonderful extraness you get even when a light breeze kicks up. Fringe basically falls under the category of trim. The different styles of trim used on parasols throughout the 19th century is such a diverse array it would be nearly impossible to cover in a small snippet, so we might cover that in its own video in the future. So, without getting too much into it, depending on what point you are in the 19th century, you can see fringe, you can see feathers, ruffles, lace, weird woven trimmy things, woven straw, embroidered flounces, everything that you can imagine. But it would take a really long time to break down when they use those trims, so I think we're going to put that aside for now. Speaking about lace briefly, outside of covers being trimmed with a lace flounce or edging, you can find parasol covers completely covered in a single piece of lace, sometimes simply referred to as an overlay. These can be any kind of lace found on parasols, which we'll talk about in the future in another video. But the most common style lace you'll find will be what is frequently referred to as chantilly, and they're frequently said by modern observers to have been done by hand. Well, Chantilly lace was also called pusher lace, referring to the machine that the lace was manufactured on. The lace was made by weaving a bobbinet ground in different densities. After the bobbinet ground was woven, workers would come in by hand and put in the gimps. The gimps being the heavier weight threads that give the lace its defined pattern. Finally, what is often used as a finishing touch for a parasol is a tassel. Typically placed at the base of the finial, they can be as plain or elaborate as the manufacturer so decreed. They are infrequent survivors, but when you find them, please study them. I love making them, and I'm slowly teaching myself different passementerie techniques to make them better and better. In the period, some of these tassels are so floofy, I want to give them all the floof every time I make one. So summing up, parasols are neat. In all seriousness, it's my sincere hope that this admittedly very long video has helped those unfamiliar with parasol terminology come to a better understanding of what makes up these really quite extraordinary little pieces of fashion history. Knowing the terminology is the first step, and now that you've been formally introduced to the parasol, we can now continue with the parasol's history, or at least the part that I'm familiar with. If you enjoyed this video, please feel free to like and subscribe for more parasol-related and non-related rantings. I'm going to try to be more regular in making things for my little corner of the YouTube world, and that includes some sewing videos coming up soon. So, until next time, hide behind the parasol.